So, Modern Major General is from the Pirates of Penzance. It so happens I have my Gilbert and Sullivan book right here, and I'm gonna see if it's in here actually, because I didn't know what that song was from. Apparently, Star Trek really loves Modern Major General. Pirates of Penzance. Page 141. So Gilbert and Sullivan has plays with songs in it. Are their plays the same thing as their operas? Ah, here it is! Song by the Major General. I am the very model of a modern Major General. I have information, vegetable, animal, and mineral. I know the kings of England, and I quote the fights historical from Marathon to Waterloo. We're gonna get there next. In order categorical. I'm very well acquainted too with matters mathematical. I understand equations, both simple and quadratical. About binomia theorem, I'm teeming with a lot of news, with many cheerful facts about the square of the hypotenuse. Never actually listened to this entire thing before. I've heard like the first 2 or 3 lines of this, and that's it. So I didn't know he went on singing about math. Also, Eric LRL that gave me this comment said that there's a movie version from 1983 that's very good, so we might have to check that one out. Alright, so putting Gilbert and Sullivan aside for now, we're going to get back to Howard Goodall. We are on episode 5, part 2. Good place. I'll just put it right here. We are on episode 5, part 2. I almost did the 2 but the other way around, but I found out that that's not a good thing to do over in the UK. I think we left off right before he started talking about Debussy, but before we get to that, I want to revisit some of your comments that answered my questions from the last video or just offered some really cool info. Let's take a look at that, and if you want to skip right to the reaction, hit the reaction chapter down below. But first of all, let's get to your comments. So they were showing a lot of paintings in the last video that kind of coincided with the music. They were very soft pastels, nice little like pictures of the countryside, which went along really well with the music that they were talking about. And I asked, were the paintings like contemporary with the music? And Zaftra says that the paintings are French Impressionists. Now that he or she says that, I do recognize like the Impressionism. They go on to say the art equivalent of the music, Renoir, Seurat, Monet, and so forth. Of course, I've heard of those artists quite a bit, and I probably have seen 1 or 2 of their paintings at the Getty before, but art is one of those things that I just have not really done much with at all. I just wasn't really brought up with it, so that would be, I've said in past videos, it would be an interesting subject to get into eventually. But to go along with that, Yazik V2Main also said the same thing. The art is very much contemporary with the music. These 3 paintings you asked about, Renoir, Van Gogh. I did see a Van Gogh at the Getty. And Gabrielle Fauré? I always feel like I'm never pronouncing this stuff correctly. But the dates are all like in the 1860s, 1880s, which is very contemporary with the music that we're learning about right now with Howard Goodall. So yeah, that was, I like that they actually showed paintings that were contemporary with the music. Sam Bass said, just a side note to reference the Hovis ad that we watched in the last video. It was directed by Ridley Scott, he says, who directed, you know, Alien and Blade Runner and Gladiator, very, very famous director. So I did not know that. What an interesting, well, I guess it was before he became a big film director, but very, very different sort of project for him, I guess. If you watched the last video, you know how disgusted I was by the opera, was it Salome? Was that how you say that? With the decapitated head of John the Baptist, and the one that they were using in this particular case looked very realistic, and so it just grossed me out. But Pierre Claudier says, the opera Salome was an adoption of a play written in French by Oscar Wilde. Well, I guess I know that I will not be watching the opera Salome, or, you know, watching the play or reading it probably, because I can't do decapitated heads. Going back to the homicide, we did learn that Dvorak was the composer of the music in it, and we do know that he was over here in the US composing music and became well known for kind of having that more New World sound. And so I was listening to the music in the homicide wondering where it came from, and Neil Beatty says that the homicide is a largo second movement from the New World Symphony, just sped up a little bit. So that music was actually New World music. It didn't have that super distinctive, what I would call Americana sound, so it kind of threw me off a little bit, but you know what? I guess it had everything to do with the New World. Old Man Jim H says, wondering what more recent type of music you listen to since classical isn't in high demand in popular music. I've had a few people ask me about this, actually. The reason I wanted to explore classical music was just because it's probably some of the music that I know the least about, and it's just always been a goal of mine to learn more about classical music. But as far as recent music goes, I mean, really started listening to music kind of in the late 90s and the 2000s. Don't hate me, but I was like a big NSYNC fan. But I really enjoyed all of kind of like the modern music from that era, you know, even like hip hop and, you know, rock and pop. I like Green Day, for instance. But I'd have to say though that my favorite music of all is actually 60s rock / pop. My parents grew up during that era, and so they brought me up on their music. So I grew up listening to all of the music from the 60s, some in the 50s and some in the 70s as well. But there's just something about that 60s sound that really gets me. I just love it. And just in case you're wondering, my favorite band from that era is the Beach Boys. I know it may be heresy to say that the Beatles isn't your favorite band or whatever, but I really, really like the beach sound of the Beach Boys, and they are partly what inspired me to move to California, so I feel kind of a connection with them in a way that I don't with other bands, I suppose. But even then, I can go back further to the 40s, and I love big band music like Glenn Miller and his other contemporary who played the clarinet, who was also really Benny Goodman. And then I love like all of the standards, Frank Sinatra, Dean Martin, the Rat Pack. I love the Rat Pack. So I enjoy music actually going all the way back to like the 40s. I would say that the genre of music that I like the least is probably country music, even though I'm from Tennessee and from the South. It doesn't really appeal to me that much. PC Gaming for the win says, I really feel like Mahler came way short in this one, as did a lot of the other composers in the last part. They seem to only pick like one or two aspects of them and ignore so much of what makes their music great. I did actually make this point in my intro in the last video about Wagner, and the same goes for some other composers in the past where they just mentioned like their short songs and completely ignored a lot of their symphonies and stuff. So I completely agree with you. This is still a really good series and I'm getting a lot out of it. I suppose they didn't really have time to showcase, you know, the whole of the compositions of each one of these composers. So I guess they had to kind of choose a direction to go in. But yeah, I agree. It is a little frustrating when you don't really get the full picture of them. Alright, so I'm going to leave it there with your comments. I really appreciate all the ones that you leave below. They really help me. And I know that you guys enjoy reading the comments too because you learn a lot from them as well. So we're going to go ahead and watch part 2 of this. I don't really have anything to say about it because I don't really know what to expect other than we're going to get into Debussy. So let's see what the rest of the late 1800s has in store with us, and let's see if he gets into the 20th century at all before this episode ends.
That's already 33 and counting. Debussy, inspired by Mussorgsky, ditched 100 years of studious development technique and started over. Mussorgsky because he knew no better, and Debussy because it suited his taste for experiment. What revolutionized Debussy's music more than anything, though, was a wind of change blown into the Paris World's Fair from very far afield. The World's Fair showcased exhibits and cultural tableaux from all over the planet. Thanks to increased communications, the global village was starting to become a reality.
I do know shadow puppetry came from Asia, and if any of you follow me on Instagram, you know that I have posted, I think on Twitter too, I posted a picture of me doing puppets, and I've been a puppeteer for a very long time, so I am familiar with shadow puppetry and various other things to do with puppetry. I think it came from Asia. I could be wrong, but I think that's what they're implying here as well, that this art form came from the Far East.
What especially mesmerized Debussy was a Javanese village, complete with a gamelan orchestra, with its gongs, bells, bowls, and xylophone-like chimes.
The particular sonorities and scales of the gamelan orchestra intrigued Debussy so much he was inspired to attempt an evocation of its Eastern sounds on a Western piano. Although he couldn't replicate the unfamiliar tuning of the bells, gongs, and other metal bars of the gamelan, or the exact division of the Asian musical scale, he could approximate it in two ways. One was to make use of the so-called pentatonic scale, the 5 notes that are common to all the world's musical systems, and which are especially prevalent in Eastern music. On a piano, the pentatonic notes can be found by playing just the black notes.
Oh, that does sound very Asian.
There's a whole section of his prelude, Voile, Sails, which is all pentatonic.
Interesting. I had no idea.
The other trick Debussy deployed was to allow his chords to hang over each other, overlapping and ricocheting from one to the next. This technique, on the piano at any rate, has the effect of eking out the sympathetic resonances, or harmonics, latent in the reverberating strings.
Natural harmonics are hidden extra notes, usually quite high in pitch, that are found within any given sound, like the additional colours of the spectrum contained within white light. Every time you allow the felt dampers on a piano to clamp down on the strings, you shut off the natural harmonics from resonating. But Debussy wanted to do the opposite, allow the strings to ring like they would on a harp. His hanging chords, with the dampers kept away from the strings, were a kind of return to nature. Putting these ideas into action, Debussy created a new soundscape for the piano. The reformation of scales and harmonies that he introduced offered a whole new palette of aural possibilities. Piano had never sounded so exotic and so rich.
This is really interesting. I didn't know this wasn't a thing until he came along. See, this is the type of music you'd be listening to like at the spa, or just when you just want to like relax.
By recalibrating the traditional Western scale on Eastern lines, Debussy's music was a radical departure from the classical style he'd grown up with, and his harmonic experiments based on Asian sound combinations were still influencing musicians, especially in jazz, half a century later. As well as kicking off a highly fruitful interest in what we'd call world music, the World's Fair in Paris had also put the new music of Russia on the map. Another of St. Petersburg's musical dynamos, Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov, took over the torch and mined the golden seam of Slavic folklore in a series of operatic pageants put on around the turn of the century. Rimsky didn't just use folk stories in his plots. Crucially, he also started to borrow the melodic building blocks of Russian folk music.
Heard this before. It's really pretty.
These sparkling entertainments laid down a challenge to Rimsky-Korsakov's most talented pupil, then a complete unknown. That challenge was to blaze a path for Russian music and put Russia onto the cultural map once and for all. And boy, was the challenge accepted. Rimsky-Korsakov's pupil was Igor Stravinsky.
Oh, Stravinsky. I was wondering who he was talking
Stravinsky's
about.
combustible arrival on the world music scene was stage managed by an entrepreneurial art, dance and music impresario, Sergei Diaghilev. In 1909, he created a dance company in Paris, the Ballet Russe, in order to produce annual festivals of modernist Russian ballets. He approached Stravinsky to compose the music for one based on an ancient Russian fairy tale, The Firebird. When he was commissioned, Stravinsky was unknown and third choice for the job. 3 years later, he was both the most notorious and the most eagerly championed composer in all Europe. The Firebird's scenario, an amalgam of several versions of folk tales about a magical bird, combines supernatural characters and beasts with the natural, the fantastical world with the human world.
Stravinsky gives these two worlds different styles of music. Human characters, like the 12 princesses in the story, are given folk song-derived melodies based on the common Western musical scale.
Question about these ballets and these dance performances. Are there certain moves that are choreographed that everybody does? I mean, almost like they're written into the piece, or is every time that they're performed, does the choreographer get to kind of come up with their own dances, their own version of it? I've actually never thought about that before. I guess I just assumed that the choreographer had free reign every single time they performed it, and they would just come up with their own kind of rendition of it. For those of you who are more familiar with ballets and like dance performances, let me know if that's the case.
The fantastical creatures and characters, on the other hand, are allotted a much more exotic and complex musical palette, often based on the so-called octatonic scale. This non-Western sounding octatonic scale had been the feature of the music of Stravinsky's teacher, Rimsky-Korsakov, especially when depicting the magical, malevolent, or the mysterious.
When Stravinsky borrows from Russian ethnic folk music like this, he doesn't lift it straight, but distorts it through a mischievous prism. In field recordings of peasant folk music, the educated bourgeois Stravinsky had discovered a raw, ritualistic world from way beyond the frontiers of industrial civilization. His instinct to repackage it for a Parisian audience was brilliantly provocative.
No, Stravinsky's music, or at least what I'm hearing here, it's reminding me of like really early Hollywood films. You know, I can imagine the famous dancers in Hollywood. I'm gonna have to look this up for whatever reason. I'm horrible at remembering names. Fred Astaire, Gene Kelly. But I think of Fred Astaire. When I hear things like this, I'm just reminded of those like Hollywood musicals where they would have these like dance numbers. This is what it sounds like to me. Like this style of music. I can perfectly see this in some of those films. I'm not sure when Stravinsky came on because they didn't really give a date. I'm sorry, I'm pausing way too long here. Okay, he was born in 1882, so he would have been probably composing in the early 20th century. He died in New York, so he apparently lived over here in the States at some point. Yeah, I don't want to get too far into this. I just feel like some of his music might have been used, or his style would have been used in early Hollywood. I'll have to do a separate video on him and learn more about that.
Stravinsky's rebellion against established musical conventions wasn't just about exotic scales and weird jingly-jangly sounds he injected into the orchestra. Stravinsky, like Mussorgsky and Debussy before him, wanted to find a way of assembling a musical structure without using constantly developing nuggets of tune. Stravinsky, in particular, wanted to tell his ballet stories a different way. He created a montage, an oral jigsaw, one tune followed by a different tune, followed by a different tune in tumbling succession. For this reason, ballet, with its short, restless, kaleidoscopic episodes, was the form for which Stravinsky was born to compose.
We find the idea of musical collage, the mix, the remix, the iPod shuffle and the mashup, completely normal. But we shouldn't forget how bewilderingly unfamiliar an idea this was to the musical establishment of the early 1900s. When the Ballet Russe took Stravinsky's second ballet, Petrushka, to Vienna in 1913, the scandalised musicians refused to play it, describing it as dirty music. All of the radicals, Mahler, Debussy and Stravinsky, were dismantling the old system whereby musical ideas carefully unfolded one thing after another. They wanted everything at once.
Stravinsky, like all Russian composers, was turned on by the rhythmic urgency of dance. But he did something very unusual with that rhythm. Whilst Mahler had layered melody on melody, tangled together like a twisted knot, and Debussy had manipulated blocks of adjacent sound overlapping one another, Stravinsky went one step further, superimposing simultaneous rhythms on top of each other.
Polyrhythm, as it has since been dubbed, had long existed in African tribal drumming, improvised on the spot by highly intuitive, skillful players. But polyrhythm, conceived from scratch by a composer, written down on the page, imposed on the Western Symphony Orchestra player by player, this was utterly, breathtakingly novel a concept. It was as if Stravinsky wanted the past and the present to coexist in one dimension, the prehistoric ritual of his dancers and the modern cacophony of the industrial world, and the only way he could conceive it was to make parallel, competing rhythmic patterns fight for the same space. It's complicated, but it's magnificent.
I think I'm gonna like Stravinsky. I love this. This type of stuff is so fun to listen to. I also want to watch some of these Russian ballets. They look really interesting to me.
But here's the thing. The Rite of Spring, which premiered 100 years ago, was the high watermark of musical modernism. It therefore presented progressive music with a dilemma. Where the hell to go from here? Neither Stravinsky nor Debussy in 1913 would have guessed where the answer to that question would come from, never mind just how massive the forces of change were going to be. After all, revolutions don't always start with a bang.
Mary had a little lamb, its fleet white as snow, and everywhere that Mary went, the lamb was sure to go.
Thomas Edison is credited with the invention of recorded sound in 1877, but in fact the first ever recording was made nearly 20 years earlier in France.
Really?
This is the earliest known surviving recording of a person singing, making the man who made it, Edouard Léon Scott de Martinville, the true inventor of recording, not Edison.
Oh.
The recording was made on a machine now virtually forgotten, the phonautograph. Here's the amazing bit. The inventor's aim was to be able to study sound in graph-like form. What he couldn't do was play the sound back. Then, in 2008, American engineers using sophisticated digital technology were able to convert the markings on the paper back into sound. The French folk singer of 1860 miraculously sang again. Sort of.
Okay, so he invented the recording technology, but Edison was the first one that was able to play it back, which is what made it valuable. So, yeah, I guess there's a technicality there, but Edison, I guess, would be the one to get the credit for, you know, being able to, play the audio back and record it, kind of as we know how to do it today. This is very interesting, though. I didn't know about this this guy in France, though. It's interesting that they were playing with this back in the 1850s.
The phonautograph had begun a process that was
I can kinda hear what
totally
he's-
to transform music. Very soon after Edison invented a machine that could play recordings back, a new breed of musician researcher popped up in virtually every country, travelling around remote rural areas, recording and preserving the folk songs they persuaded doubtless bemused locals to perform for them. These field recordists captured the oral and musical culture of communities now long disappeared. But the real future for recorded sound was in the reproduction of music that was already popular. The first million-selling record was Caruso's Vesti la Giubba in 1907, just before radio broadcasts began. As well as live music, radio also played records, thus boosting their sales.
Wait, so record players were a thing back in 1907? I didn't know they went that far back. I don't know when I thought that people started listening to records, but I guess I thought it was like in the 1920s or something. I didn't know that they had it before then. And $1 million in sales, too. That's pretty
The
good.
advent of recording made the huge wealth of music already written by 1900 increasingly available to millions of people across the world, vastly expanding their musical horizons and turning something hitherto expensive and elitist into an ordinary commodity. This was a very good thing.
Recording also began to put in front of a mass audience forms of folk and ethnic music that were, up to then, unknown outside their local communities. The music that was boosted most of all by recording, as it turned out, was that produced by African Americans, beginning with spiritual songs.
When Israel was in Egypt, let my people go. Pressed so hard they could not stand. Let my people go. Go down, Moses. Way down in Egypt's land.
This is a good choir.
You got to let my people go. 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 Let them go.
African American slaves and their descendants, living in conditions of oppressive poverty, developed a form of religious song, the spiritual, which seems to have been an amalgam of half-remembered African call and response chants and missionary hymns.
Swing low, sweet chariot, come in for to carry me home. Sweet
I know these songs.
These spirituals of the Deep South were rich with Old Testament references to the slavery of the Israelites, visions of redemption and heavenly justice.
I looked over Jordan, what did I see? Coming for to carry me home, a band of angels.
It's hard not to sing with it.
The existence of the spiritual was for a long time mostly unknown to the white population of the United States, let alone the rest of the world. But a long fuse had been lit.
People go to baseball and like to play good with too. If you ask them about their religion, they'll say they're just as good as you.
The Fisk Jubilee Singers, who were themselves the children of slaves, began to make fundraising tours singing what were called at the time Negro spirituals. But strangely, one of the first musicians to put this music in front of a middle-class American audience was an Englishman. The Edwardian Samuel Coleridge Taylor caused a sensation on 3 trips to the USA, conducting his own compositions. In one of them,
We can hear early and tantalizing evidence of the melodic style of what came to be known as the blues, which, albeit in different disguises, went on to dominate the music of the 20th century and beyond. The clues we're looking for are so-called flattened degrees of the musical ladder, or scale, at the 3rd and 7th position, especially when the phrase is heading in a downward direction. And here they both are, one after another, in this melody. 3rd, 7th. The blues, as it developed slowly and piecemeal amongst former slave communities in the USA in the final decades of the 19th century, clung resolutely to the flattened 3rds and 7ths, and does so to the present day. Indeed, they became known as blue notes.
Play it, thing, boy.
Blue notes, revivalist spirituals, the call and response or holler songs of the Deep South, all derived from their African origins, went into the mixing pot of the early blues. But also mixed in were chords borrowed from hymns and parlor and vaudeville songs, and the folk songs of other members of the American underclass.
Say that you never hear me anymore.
There's been considerable research into song forms of the poorest Americans of all ethnic groups in the 19th century. It reveals the influence of Anglo-Celtic folk music on the growth of the blues. This folk music was learnt from the African Americans' co-workers in the cotton fields and on the railroads, many of whom were from the British Isles. Among
I just also have to say really quickly that I grew up in Memphis, which is kind of known as the city for the blues, where it was really made famous here in Memphis. We have a lot of blues musicians that come from here. We have Beale Street downtown, which has a lot of blues bars and restaurants. They have live blues bands there. We have B.B. King, who has his own restaurant. Of course, he's not with us anymore, but he's a really famous blues musician. So I grew up around the blues. I grew up in the South. We have cotton fields all around us here. And I don't live in a rural area, but you can just drive 15 minutes and there are cotton fields out here. So I'm surrounded by this culture and grew up in this culture. And of course, Elvis is from here, and he took a lot of his music from the blues. And a lot of the African Americans here in Memphis, he took his music from them. So yeah, I've grown up with all of this and been surrounded by it for most of my life, except for when I lived out in California. A little different story out there.
Amongst these song types are hundreds which lament the burden and misery of the labourer's life.
Typical is the iconic American work song, The Ballad of John Henry, the steel-driving man, which eventually became a blues standard. It celebrates the futile battle between an African-American railroad worker and a new machine designed to replace him. Music historians have traced the shape back to the much earlier British ballad, The Birmingham Boys. Listen out for the overall storytelling shape and the repeated line at the end. In Birmingham town there lived a man, and he had such a lovely wife, and so dearly she loved company, as dearly as she loved life, boys, life, as dearly as she loved life. Now here's one of the many later versions of John Henry. John Henry was a little baby, sitting on his mother's knee. He picked up a hammer in his little right hand, says a hammer's gonna be the death of me, Lord, Lord, a hammer's gonna be the death of me. One of the changes that's happened to the tune crossing the Atlantic is that it's become entirely pentatonic. Remember those 5 basic notes prevalent in Eastern music that Debussy imitated? And who were the other railroad workers toiling alongside the British, Irish and African-American labourers?
Chinese? No. Yes. Chinese out in the West.
Now, even to suggest any European influence on the blues is controversial, and it's entirely understandable that there should be sensitivity about any non-African elements in the origin of the blues. Since the music of the slaves, from which it sprang, was so often a lament or a coded protest against the harsh treatment they received, some African Americans quite naturally resent the idea that the blues could in any way have been influenced by the very people who enslaved their ancestors. But the fact is that music does not observe racial or national boundaries. It's a free-flowing river, open and available to all cultures, owned by none.
Yeah, but like I agree with that, by the way. But I also was surprised, just as an American, not even an African American, just as an American, that there was any English influence in the blues at all. I had no idea about that.
Went into its kit of parts. The early blues musicians made something unique and lasting of their own. This same intermingling of styles and traditions can be seen in the arrival at around the same time of ragtime, which became a kind of craze.
Rag, or ragtime music, originated in St. Louis and Chicago bars and brothels, from house pianists copying the popular marching band style of the 1880s and 90s, a fashion that reached its peak with the band leader John Philip Sousa. In order to emulate the whole band, bass, accompanying chords and tune, the pianist had to leap about the keys frantically, resulting in a quite virtuoso left-hand motion from bass to chord and back. On top of this accompanying oompa, the rag pianists wove a catchy tune that pulled the rhythm around, a technique called syncopation.
It's disgusting how easily he can just do all of this on the piano.
Syncopation is like talking, with the emphasis on the wrong words to create a jerky sound. Listen to this bit of Scott Joplin's Maple Leaf Rag without syncopation. And now with Joplin's syncopations, which feel like they're tripping ahead of where you'd expect them to fall.
It's definitely more fun with the syncopation.
Ragtime picked up syncopation, a playful jumping ahead of the tune, from the banjo or piano accompaniments for cakewalks, a jokey form of dancing that plantation workers had invented for their own amusement, in lampooning imitation of white folks' la-di-da ballroom dancing. The white folks in question used to enjoy watching their staff's cakewalk parties not realizing that what they thought was a comic and ludicrous African-American dance step was actually a caricature of them.
Of course.
Along with the cakewalk, another offspring of ragtime was a hyper-syncopated form of piano and band playing that flickered into life in the Storyville district of New Orleans. Charismatic
New Orleans,
performers
that's
like
the-
Jelly Roll Morton took it on tour around the southern states in travelling vaudeville shows. Though Jelly Roll called a lot of his numbers blues, we now know this is the beginning of a distinct genre of its own, jazz.
Jazz, like Dixieland jazz. This is Dixieland jazz, not just jazz.
From now on, this music took on a life of its own. As up-to-the-minute blues and its many offspring began to revolutionise popular music, classically trained composers found themselves outflanked and increasingly unloved.
Given the choice, the general public voted with their feet in their millions and took the populist path. The coming century would see popular music, especially American popular music, sweeping the planet. And yet, faced with the twin rebellions of dissonant modernism and the mass market, the classical tradition found an ace up its sleeve and played it with impeccable timing. In a world of turmoil and change, its response was nostalgia. Edward Elgar's most famous piece, Enigma Variations, embodies this response. As the world began to slide towards a final showdown of the European empires, this music reminded people what they were about to lose.
From Elgar and Vaughan Williams in Britain, Grieg in Norway, Sibelius in Finland, Respighi in Italy, Rachmaninoff in Russia and Richard Strauss in Germany, a musical style of tender, old-fashioned melancholy seemed to want to hold back the relentless passage of time and progress.
That this music is so popular in our own time testifies to its enduring appeal and perhaps our own continuing need for its soothing balm. It may also indicate that in a crowded market, classical music's unique selling point is, like it or not, its ability to wrap up the past like a beautiful gift.
In the next programme, we trace how all the developments of this 30-year period found affirmation in a golden age of popular music. Classical music went undercover, morphing gloriously into a variety of new musical forms, made possible by the onwards march of technology.
Alright, well, we did get into the 20th century, so I was wondering if we were going to get into that at all, because we were getting up to the end of the 19th century, yeah. So, takeaways from this: I like Stravinsky. I had no idea that I would like him. When I think about Russian composers, for some reason, Stravinsky doesn't come to mind. I think Tchaikovsky, for some reason. And I feel like, as far as reputation, as far as famous composers, Tchaikovsky overshadows Stravinsky. At least, I don't know, maybe that's just my own exposure. I feel like I've heard way more about Tchaikovsky than I have Stravinsky. But Stravinsky's music is also very famous because I've heard it before as well. Who knew I would be a sucker for like Russian classical music? I seem to really like it. And also, like I mentioned, the ballets, the dances that they showed and stuff looked really, really fun to watch actually. And, you know, paired with the music, I think I would enjoy watching them. So we're gonna have to do that. We're gonna watch some of these ballets and I guess some of the operas. I do want to give the operas a chance, even though they're not really, I don't know, like I don't feel really drawn to that sort of music, but I will give him a chance. But I am really excited to get into the 20th century, into more familiar music. I'm sure that I'm probably going to have heard most, if not all, of the music that we're going to hear in the next episode, just because, like I said, I am familiar with music going a few decades back. But I also enjoy Aaron Copland's music as well, and I know he is a classical composer from America, and I wonder if they're going to get into film music, because I feel like that film music today, the film scores, are our version of classical music nowadays. I know that there are classical composers still, and they still compose music. They just don't get exposure though. But everybody can probably hum the tune to Star Wars or Star Trek or Indiana Jones, you know, all of these famous movies that we know the music to. That is kind of, I feel like, our classical music today, or should I say our symphonic music, because it's not really, I guess, I don't know if you can call it classical music if it's current. Anyway, I really learned a lot in this, especially, you know, talking about the technology of the invention of recording of the sound, learning a lot about the origin of the blues, learning that there is some British influence in that. So only 2 more episodes left. I'm trying to remember not to turn this around. So anyway, if you enjoyed this video, make sure that you like and subscribe. I also have some social media that you can follow me on if you are so inclined. If you're on Facebook, look for my Facebook group, because that is where all of the fun discussion takes place. Beethoven here, and I want to thank you guys for watching, and we hope that you will join us next time.